The moment Marcus Harrington III stepped into that courtroom with a diamond-encrusted watch worth more than most people's homes, Judge Elias Monroe knew exactly what kind of trial this would be. If you're ready to see real justice served, hit that like button right now. The courtroom fell into that particular kind of silence that only exists in sacred spaces, churches, libraries, and rooms where lives are decided. The mahogany walls seemed to absorb sound rather than reflect it, and the morning light filtered through tall windows in pale golden streams that illuminated particles of dust floating like witnesses suspended in time. Judge Elias Monroe sat behind the bench, his weathered hands folded before him, his grey eyes revealing nothing but seeing everything. At 63, he'd presided over thousands of cases, but he could always sense when something extraordinary was about to unfold. Today, the air itself felt charged. Marcus Harrington III entered through the defendant's door, and the atmosphere shifted like a barometric drop before a storm. He was 28 years old, but carried himself with the aggressive confidence of someone who'd never been truly denied anything. His suit was Italian, custom-tailored, probably worth $15,000. His shoes were hand-stitched leather that clicked against the floor with metronomic precision. His dark hair was styled with the kind of casual perfection that required significant time and money to achieve. But it was his expression that made everyone in the courtroom bristle, a slight smile, almost amused, as if he were attending a mildly entertaining show rather than his own criminal trial. His attorney, Gerald Whitmore, was a shark in a $1,000 suit, the kind of lawyer wealthy families kept on retainer for situations exactly like this. He walked beside Marcus with the bearing of someone who'd made plenty of problems disappear before breakfast. The prosecution table held Assistant District Attorney Jennifer Torres, a woman in her late 30s who'd clawed her way up from the Bronx with nothing but brains and determination. She wore a simple grey suit and carried herself with the quiet intensity of someone who'd seen enough injustice to fuel a lifetime of righteous anger. Beside her sat manila folders thick with evidence, each one representing hours of investigation, witness interviews, and meticulous documentation. Judge Monroe's bailiff, Thomas Reed, a former Marine who'd served in Iraq before finding his calling in the court system, called the room to order. All rise for the Honorable Judge Elias Monroe presiding. Everyone stood. Marcus Harrington III took an extra 2 seconds, making a show of adjusting his cufflinks first. "Be seated," Monroe said, his voice carrying that particular quality of quiet authority that made shouting unnecessary. The courtroom settled. Case number 47 CR 8834. The People versus Marcus Harrington III. Charges include vehicular manslaughter, driving under the influence causing death, leaving the scene of an accident, and obstruction of justice. He paused, letting each charge hang in the air. "Mr. Harrington, you understand these charges?" Marcus leaned toward his attorney, whispered something that made Whitmore's jaw tighten, then spoke directly to the judge. "I understand the charges, Your Honor. I also understand this is a waste of everyone's time." A ripple of shocked murmurs moved through the gallery. Judge Monroe's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes. Recognition, perhaps, of the kind of arrogance he'd encountered before but hoped never to see again. "Mr. Whitmore, you might want to advise your client on courtroom decorum," Monroe said evenly. Whitmore placed a hand on Marcus's arm, but Marcus shook it off. "With respect, Your Honor, my client is exercising his First Amendment rights. In my courtroom, your client will exercise respect for the legal process," Monroe replied. "Ms. Torres, your opening statement." Jennifer Torres stood, buttoning her jacket, and approached the jury box. 12 citizens sat there. A construction worker, a nurse, a retired teacher, a grocery store manager, a software engineer, a stay-at-home mother, an electrician, an accountant, a barista, a postal worker, a freelance writer, and a social worker. They represented the cross-section of humanity that Marcus Harrington III had never had to answer to in his entire privileged life. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Torres began, her voice clear and strong. On the night of March 15th, Sarah Chen was driving home from her shift at Mercy Hospital, where she worked as an ICU nurse. She was 29 years old. She'd just finished a double shift caring for COVID patients, putting her own life at risk to save others. She was driving carefully, following all traffic laws, heading home to her apartment where her 6-year-old daughter, Emily, was waiting with her grandmother. Torres moved slowly, deliberately, making eye contact with each juror. At approximately 11:47 p.m., as Sarah drove through the intersection of Madison and 43rd Street, an intersection she'd crossed safely thousands of times, the defendant's Ferrari, traveling at an estimated 95 miles per hour in a 30-mile-per-hour zone, ran a red light and struck Sarah's vehicle on the driver's side. The impact was so severe that Sarah's car was pushed 30 feet and wrapped around a light pole. Sarah Chen died at the scene. She never made it home to Emily. She never got to see her daughter graduate from first grade last month. The courtroom was absolutely silent. You could hear the air conditioning hum, someone's watch ticking, the shallow breathing of people trying not to cry. The defendant had a blood alcohol content of 0.17, more than twice the legal limit. Torres continued. Security footage from 3 different cameras captured him running the red light. Witnesses saw him stumble out of his Ferrari, look at Sarah's destroyed vehicle, and then get back in his car and drive away. He left her there. He didn't call 911. He didn't check if she was alive. He fled the scene and called his attorney before he called emergency services. Marcus yawned, actually yawned, covering his mouth with the back of his hand, like someone bored at a lecture. Several jurors' faces hardened. The evidence will show that Marcus Harrington III, son of billionaire real estate developer Marcus Harrington Jr., believed, and apparently still believes, that his wealth and family name place him above the law. The evidence will show that he's been arrested for DUI twice before, and both times the charges mysteriously disappeared. The evidence will show a pattern of reckless entitlement and zero regard for human life. And the evidence will show, beyond any reasonable doubt, that he is guilty of every single charge. Torres returned to her seat. Judge Monroe looked to the defense table. Mr. Whitmore, your opening statement. Gerald Whitmore stood, projecting confidence like cologne. Your Honor, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, we are here today not because of facts, but because of feelings. The prosecution wants you to be angry. They want you to be sad. They want you to see a tragic accident and assign blame to someone with the misfortune of being born into wealth. But feelings aren't evidence. My client was involved in a terrible accident, on a night when visibility was poor, when traffic signals were malfunctioning due to recent storms, when he was driving home from a business dinner where he'd had 2 drinks, well within legal limits, according to our expert witnesses, who will testify that the blood test was improperly administered. The prosecution's case is built on assumptions, circumstantial evidence, and class prejudice. He gestured toward Marcus, who sat straighter, suddenly projecting wounded innocence. Marcus Harrington is not a criminal. He's a young entrepreneur who runs 3 successful startups employing over 200 people. He's a philanthropist who's donated millions to children's hospitals. And he's a human being who's been living with the knowledge that his vehicle was involved in a tragic accident. He didn't flee. He was in shock, disoriented from the impact, and drove to a safe location before calling for help. Everything the prosecution will claim is sinister has an innocent explanation, and we will provide that explanation. Thank you. The trial proceeded like a slow-motion car crash, ironic given the circumstances. The prosecution called witness after witness. A bartender from the Vanguard Club, an exclusive establishment where Marcus had been drinking that night, testified that he'd served Marcus 6 vodka tonics over 3 hours. Security footage confirmed this. The bartender remembered because Marcus had left a $100 tip and said, "This is how real men drink." On cross-examination, Whitmore suggested the bartender might be misremembering, motivated by the prospect of suing someone wealthy. The bartender, a veteran putting himself through community college, looked insulted but maintained his composure. A traffic engineer testified that the intersection signals were functioning perfectly that night, producing maintenance logs and digital records. Marcus scrolled through his phone during this testimony until Judge Monroe said, "Mr. Harrington, put the device away, or I'll have the bailiff confiscate it." Marcus complied with exaggerated slowness. Sarah Chen's mother, Liu Chen, took the stand. She was 61, a Chinese immigrant who'd come to America with nothing and built a small tailoring business. Her English was accented but clear, her pain universal. "Sarah was good girl," she said, tears streaming down her face. "Work hard, love her daughter, never complain. Now Emily asks me every night, 'When is Mommy coming home?' What I tell her, how I explain that man," she pointed at Marcus, "that man kill her mother and drive away like trash on street." Marcus's lawyer objected. "Your Honor, inflammatory." "Overruled," Monroe said quietly. "Mrs. Chen, continue." "Emily have nightmares. She draw pictures at school of car crash. She wet bed now, something she never do before. She lost mother. I lost daughter. We lost everything. And he..." She looked directly at Marcus, who was examining his fingernails. "He don't even care, don't even look at me, don't even say sorry." When Mrs. Chen stepped down, several jurors were crying. Marcus leaned over to his attorney and whispered something that made him look uncomfortable. Later, a courtroom sketch artist would report that she'd overheard Marcus say, "How much longer is this sob story going to take?" The medical examiner testified about Sarah's injuries: multiple fractures, internal bleeding, traumatic brain injury. Death would have been relatively quick but not painless. The defense tried to suggest she might have survived if she'd been wearing her seatbelt differently, but the ME shut that down immediately. At that speed and angle of impact, a NASA spacesuit wouldn't have saved her. Then came the surveillance footage. The prosecution had compiled video from 3 cameras that captured the intersection. The lights turned green for Sarah. She entered the intersection at normal speed, maybe 25 miles per hour. Then from the left, a silver Ferrari appeared like a missile, barely visible before impact. The crash itself was horrifying, metal crumpling, glass exploding, Sarah's sedan spinning and slamming into the pole. The Ferrari bounced off, spun, and came to rest 50 feet away. For 30 seconds, nothing moved. Then the Ferrari's door opened and Marcus climbed out. The footage was grainy, but clear enough to see him walk towards Sarah's car, get close enough to see inside, then return to his Ferrari and drive away on 3 working wheels, sparks flying from the 4th. The courtroom watched in horrified silence. When the video ended, Judge Monroe said, "We'll take a 15-minute recess." Several jurors looked like they needed air. When they reconvened, the defense presented their case. They called an expert witness who questioned the blood test's chain of custody, a technical argument that seemed to bore even the expert making it. They called character witnesses who testified about Marcus's philanthropy, though under cross-examination, Torres got each one to admit that Marcus's donations were actually his father's, made through a family foundation for tax purposes, and that Marcus himself had never volunteered a single hour of his time to any charitable cause. They called a biomechanical engineer who testified that the crash could have been caused by various factors. But Torres dismantled him by getting him to admit he'd been paid $50,000 for his testimony and that his entire analysis was based on hypotheticals rather than the actual evidence. Then Whitmore made his critical mistake. He called Marcus to the stand. Marcus approached the witness box with that same slight smile, as if this were all beneath him. He was sworn in, sat down, and immediately adjusted the microphone to his preferred height, a small gesture of control. Whitmore led him through the softball questions. Where had he been that night? At a business dinner. How much had he drunk? 2 drinks? Maybe 3. Why did he leave the scene? Shock, confusion, fear. Did he feel remorse? Absolutely. Every day. Marcus delivered these answers with the kind of rehearsed sincerity that wouldn't fool a child. His eyes were flat. His voice was modulated but empty. He was performing concerned citizen, the way someone might perform happy customer in a commercial. Then Jennifer Torres stood for cross-examination, and the temperature in the room dropped 10 degrees. "Mr. Harrington," she began, standing at the prosecution table rather than approaching him, "you testified that you had 2, maybe 3 drinks that night. The bartender testified you had 6. Why is he lying?" "I don't think he's lying," Marcus said smoothly. "I think he's mistaken. It was a busy night. You left a $100 tip. He remembered you specifically. He remembered what you drank and what you said, but he's wrong about the number. People make mistakes." Torres picked up a document. "You were arrested for DUI in 2019. You'd had, according to the police report, 8 drinks. You told the officer," she read from the report, "Do you know who my father is?" And the charges were dropped the next day. "Coincidence?" "Objection relevance," Whitmore said, standing. "Goes to pattern of behavior, Your Honor," Torres countered. "I'll allow it," Monroe said. "Answer the question, Mr. Harrington." Marcus's smile finally slipped. That was a misunderstanding. The breathalyzer was faulty. And in 2021, another DUI arrest. Again, the charges disappeared. Another faulty breathalyzer. "I wasn't charged because I wasn't guilty." Torres moved closer now, slowly, like a predator who'd spotted weakness. "Mr. Harrington, when you got out of your Ferrari and approached Ms. Chen's vehicle, what did you see?" "It was dark. I was confused. You walked directly to her car. The footage shows you getting close enough to look inside. What did you see?" Marcus shifted in his seat. "I don't remember clearly." "Did you see her?" "I think there was someone. It was dark." "Did you see blood?" His jaw tightened. "Maybe." "Did you hear anything? A cry for help? Labored breathing? Anything?" "No." "So you saw a person, possibly blood, in a destroyed vehicle, and you did nothing." "I was in shock." "Shock made you walk away? Shock made you get back in your car? Shock made you drive away while this woman died alone?" Torres's voice rose slightly, controlled fury turning each word into a weapon. "Objection!" Whitmore was on his feet. "Badgering the witness." "Sustained," Monroe said. "Ms. Torres, reframe." Torres took a breath. "Mr. Harrington, you testified you went to a safe location before calling for help. Where was this safe location?" I don't remember exactly." "You don't remember?" She picked up another document. "Phone records show you drove 3 miles before stopping. Your first call was to your attorney, Gerald Whitmore, at 11:51 p.m. The call lasted 6 minutes. Your second call was to your father at 11:58. That call lasted 3 minutes. You called 911 at 12:17 a.m., 30 minutes after the crash. Does that sound like someone in shock or someone carefully managing a situation?" Marcus's face had gone red. His hands gripped the armrests of the witness chair. "I was scared." "Scared of what?" "Scared of being blamed for something that wasn't my fault. So you left a dying woman alone because you were worried about being blamed. It was an accident you caused by driving drunk at 95 miles per hour through a red light. You don't know that. We have footage, Mr. Harrington. We have witnesses. We have your blood test. We have physics. What we don't have is remorse from you. What we don't have is accountability. What we don't have is even the basic human decency of an apology to that little girl who will never see her mother again because you thought traffic laws don't apply to people with your last name." Marcus exploded. He stood up in the witness box, face contorted with rage, and screamed, "You know what? You're right. I was drunk. I was going fast. I hit her car. And you know why I left? Because I can. Because this court works for me. Because my family has more money than this entire building is worth. My father's donated millions to the mayor's campaigns. We own half the judges in this city. This whole thing," he gestured wildly at the courtroom, "is just theater. I'll walk out of here because that's how the world actually works. People like you follow the rules. People like me make them." The courtroom erupted. Spectators gasped. Reporters frantically scribbled. Jurors stared in absolute shock. Whitmore had his head in his hands. The bailiff moved forward instinctively, hand near his weapon, and Judge Elias Monroe brought his gavel down once. Crack! The sound cut through the chaos like a gunshot, and every person in that room fell silent. Monroe didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. When he spoke, his words carried the weight of 30 years on the bench, the weight of every case he'd presided over, every injustice he'd tried to correct, every time he'd seen wealth try to corrupt justice. "Mr. Harrington," Monroe said, his voice quiet and terrible. "Sit down." Marcus sat. The rage drained from his face, replaced suddenly by the dawning realization of what he'd just done. "In 32 years of serving on this bench," Monroe continued, "I have heard many things. I have heard lies, justifications, excuses, rationalizations. I have heard remorse and apologies and promises to do better. I have heard the pleas of the guilty and the protests of the innocent. But never in 3 decades have I heard someone stand in a court of law and openly admit not just to the crime, but to the belief that they are above the law itself." He paused, letting the weight of Marcus's words sink in. "You said this court works for you. Let me tell you what this court is, Mr. Harrington. This court is the place where a waitress and a billionaire stand equal. This court is the place where your father's money cannot buy your innocence. This court is the place where a little girl who lost her mother gets to see that justice still means something. This court does not work for you. This court works for her." Monroe looked at the jury. "Ladies and gentlemen, you've heard the defendant's testimony. I'm sure you'll give it the consideration it deserves. This trial is in recess pending closing arguments tomorrow morning. Mr. Harrington will remain in custody without bail. Bailiff, take him." "What?" Marcus's face went white. "You can't, my attorney, Dad, call Dad. Your attorney will have the opportunity to argue bail conditions tomorrow," Monroe said. "But after your outburst and your confession, and make no mistake, what you just gave us was a confession, I consider you a flight risk and a danger to the community. Bailiff now." Thomas Reed moved forward, producing handcuffs. Marcus actually tried to back away, bumping into the witness box, suddenly looking very young and very scared. "No, wait. I didn't mean I was angry. Dad will fix this. He always fixes things. Your father isn't here," Monroe said simply. "Take him." The handcuffs clicked shut, and Marcus Harrington III, who'd never spent a night in jail despite 2 prior DUI arrests, was led out of the courtroom by a former Marine who'd served 3 tours protecting the very laws Marcus had claimed to be above. Marcus's $1,000 shoes dragged against the floor. His diamond watch caught the afternoon light, and every person in that courtroom watched him go with the kind of satisfaction that comes from seeing the universe correct itself. The next morning, closing arguments were brief. Torres simply reminded the jury of Marcus's own words. "I was drunk. I was going fast. I hit her car." She reminded them of Sarah Chen's daughter, of the empty chair at dinner tables, of the incalculable loss. She asked them to send a message that no amount of money places anyone above the law. Whitmore, to his credit, tried. He argued temporary insanity, duress, that Marcus had been provoked, but his heart wasn't in it. Everyone could tell. His client had confessed on the stand and shown himself to be exactly what the prosecution had claimed. A spoiled, arrogant man who thought his wealth made him invincible. The jury deliberated for 2 hours. When they returned, the forewoman, the retired teacher, stood with tears in her eyes. "We find the defendant guilty on all counts." Marcus's face crumpled. Reality, perhaps for the first time in his 28 years, had finally arrived. 1 week later, the courtroom filled again for sentencing. Sarah Chen's family sat in the front row. Her mother, her father, her 2 brothers, and little Emily, who was 6 years old and wore a pink dress and held a photo of her mother. Marcus's father, Marcus Harrington II, sat behind the defense table, a silver-haired man in a suit that probably cost $20,000, his face a mask of controlled fury. Judge Monroe reviewed the pre-sentencing report. He noted the maximum sentences for each charge. He acknowledged the defense's request for leniency, for concurrent sentences, for consideration of Marcus's youth and lack of prior convictions. Then he removed his reading glasses and looked directly at Marcus Harrington III. "Mr. Harrington, you told this court that it works for you," Monroe began. "You told this court that your family's wealth places you above the law. You told this court, in essence, that justice is for sale and you're a buyer. I want to make something very clear to you and to everyone watching these proceedings. You were wrong." He picked up his sentencing document. Sarah Chen was 29 years old. She was an ICU nurse who risked her life during a pandemic to save others. She was a mother, a daughter, a sister, a friend. She followed the rules. She worked hard. She contributed to her community. And you killed her because you believed that traffic laws, like all laws, didn't apply to you. Monroe's voice remained steady, but there was steel underneath. "The law allows me to sentence you to up to 25 years for vehicular manslaughter while intoxicated. The law allows me to add consecutive sentences for each additional charge. In your pre-sentencing memorandum, your attorney asked for leniency, suggesting that you've suffered enough, that you've lost your freedom and your reputation. Let me address that directly." He leaned forward. "You haven't suffered, Mr. Harrington. Emily Chen has suffered. She suffers every night when she can't sleep because she's waiting for a mother who will never come home. Mrs. Chen suffers every morning when she wakes up and has to face another day without her daughter. Sarah's patients, the ones she would have saved, the lives she would have touched, they suffer because she's not there. You've been inconvenienced. There's a difference." Marcus was crying now, shoulders shaking, all pretense of control gone. His father's face remained stone. "Your outburst in this courtroom was revealing," Monroe continued. "It showed us who you really are. Not the philanthropist your attorneys tried to present. Not the entrepreneur or the victim of circumstance. You're someone who's been taught by experience that wealth equals immunity, that money solves problems, that consequences are for other people. And that's the saddest part of this tragedy, because you could have been different. With all your advantages, all your education, all your opportunities, you could have been someone who contributed to society. Instead, you became someone who takes from it." He paused, making eye contact with every person in the courtroom. "This court is not for sale. Justice is not a commodity, and privilege is not armor against consequences. On the charge of vehicular manslaughter while intoxicated, I sentence you to 25 years in state prison. On the charge of leaving the scene of an accident resulting in death, I sentence you to 10 years to run consecutively. On the charge of obstruction of justice, 5 years consecutively. That's 40 years total. With good behavior, you'll be eligible for parole in 32 years. You'll be 60 years old, approximately twice Emily's current age." Gasps filled the courtroom. Marcus collapsed in his chair, sobbing. His father stood, face red, mouth opening to say something, but Monroe's gaze stopped him cold. "Mr. Harrington, the senior Mr. Harrington, if you're considering using your connections to appeal this sentence, let me save you some time." This defendant confessed on the stand. He showed no remorse. He demonstrated contempt for this court and for the law itself. Any appellate judge will uphold this sentence, and they'll do so gladly, because we all took an oath to ensure that justice is blind. Blind to wealth, blind to connections, blind to everything except the facts and the law. Monroe looked at Emily, who was watching with wide, solemn eyes. "Young lady, I want you to know something. Your mother was a hero. She saved lives every day. And today, this court honors her memory by making sure that the person who took her from you faces the full consequences of his actions. When you're older, when you understand all of this better, I hope you'll remember that the law tried to do right by her. It won't bring her back. Nothing can. But maybe it will help you believe that justice still means something." Emily nodded slowly, tears streaming down her face, clutching her mother's photo to her chest. "Bailiff, remand the defendant to state custody," Monroe said. "This court is adjourned." The gavel came down, and Marcus Harrington III was led away in handcuffs for the last time as a relatively free man. His father stormed out without looking back. Sarah's family embraced, crying, holding each other, experiencing that complex mixture of relief and grief that comes when justice is served, but the person you love is still gone. Judge Elias Monroe gathered his papers slowly, watching the courtroom empty. Another case concluded, another attempt to make the world slightly more just. He thought about Sarah Chen, about all the patients she would never treat, about Emily growing up without her mother. He thought about Marcus Harrington III, who might spend the next 30 years learning that privilege doesn't equal worth, that wealth doesn't equal value, that being born into money doesn't make you better than someone born without it. That evening, Jennifer Torres visited Sarah's family at their small home in Queens. She brought the court documents, the official verdict, the sentencing record. Mrs. Chen held them like precious artifacts, proof that her daughter's life had mattered, that her death hadn't been swept under the rug by money and power. Emily showed Torres a drawing she'd made at school, a woman in a nurse's uniform with angel wings. At the bottom, in careful crayon letters, she'd written, "Mommy Turk Hero." Torres cried in her car on the way home, the way prosecutors do when they win cases that never should have had to be prosecuted, when justice is served, but the victory feels hollow because someone beautiful and necessary is gone forever. Marcus Harrington III spent his first night in prison in a cell with grey walls and a narrow bed and no Italian suits or diamond watches or anyone who cared about his last name. He lay awake, staring at the ceiling, replaying his outburst in court, understanding for the first time that he'd destroyed himself with his own words, his own arrogance, his own absolute certainty that the rules didn't apply to him. And he cried, not for Sarah Chen, not yet, because people like Marcus take years to develop empathy for others, but for himself, for the life he'd lost, for the future that had evaporated the moment he'd said, "This court works for me," to a judge who'd spent his entire life proving that it didn't. In the end, privilege couldn't save him. Money couldn't buy his freedom. Connections couldn't erase the truth. The law, administered by people who believed in its power to equalize, had worked exactly as it was designed to, blindly, fairly, without regard to bank accounts or family names. Sarah Chen's life had value. Her death demanded accountability. And Marcus Harrington III learned what his father's money should have taught him years ago, that the most expensive thing in the world isn't a Ferrari or a mansion or a diamond watch. It's the consequences of believing you're above everyone else. Justice doesn't care what you're worth. It only cares what you've done. If you believe that real justice means accountability for everyone regardless of wealth or status, hit that like button and let me know where you're watching from in the comments. Subscribe to the channel because we're bringing you more stories where arrogance meets its match and privilege discovers its limits. Type justice for all. If you believe that every courtroom should work exactly like Judge Monroe's, fair, firm, and focused on what's right, not who's rich, the law isn't for sale and neither is justice. Remember that.